Hello, everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Halt and Catch Fire rewatch podcast. When I speak, my topic is something that I call Take the Doughnut, which is another way to say Carpe Diem, and it's all about going after the things that you want in life. Something I wanted to do this year was rewatch the show Halt and Catch Fire, but this time actually talk about it with other people. And here you are. Thank you for joining us today. And so, one of the things that I, of course, have been doing has been recapping the episodes, which we've done that now. The episodes are recapped, but the interviews are continuing. And I'm getting a chance to talk with cast and crew who worked on the show about their experience working on the show. And so, just a quick housekeeping item today before I introduce today's guest. If you are brand new to this show, and you want spoiler free coverage, check out those episode recaps. Those are spoiler free up until the episode that you're on. The interviews, we could bring up anything from any episode, any season. So just know that up front, especially with these writer interviews, which we get so much good stuff, so many good details. And I'm very excited to welcome Jamie Pachino, who is a writer credited for 107 and 206 and is the executive story editor for season one. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you.
So glad to have you here. And I tend to start in this same place for everybody. What was your road to Halt and Catch Fire? How did you get this job?
Um, I had just started working on series television. I had come to LA and worked on features and television movies. I had little kids, so I was kind of avoiding series because you can't really control your schedule. But around the time the little one went off to kindergarten, my agent, my manager were like, "You belong on series television. Please let us try." And I had done two shows as a staff writer and then as a story editor before this. But Halt was really it was like a giant leap for me because of the writing. The writers were so good, the creators, the showrunner, the experience was so good. I feel like I always refer to it as my master class going into series television. And I got it the traditional way, which is they were looking for writers. My agent manager sent in a sample. I got an interview. I got a chance to talk to everybody about it, and I'm very, very lucky that they hired me.
Oh, that's amazing. So when you come in for this, nobody knows what this show is when you start this job because you come in for season one and you don't really have much to look at. So what kind of research did you do starting this project?
Um, I mean, I'm assuming all the writers who were interviewed got a copy of the pilot, the first episode, which knocked me flat. I read it and I was like, I might be able to do this. It was so exciting on the page. You could tell it was already going to be great. And it was so rich. And what you really hope for in a pilot is something that feels like it could be several seasons, like these characters and the story and the whole, setup of it says all that. So I, I don't know anything about computer. I have a theater degree. You know what I mean? Like I don't have a computer background. So I did some research into that. Thankfully, we had the greatest advisors in the world on it. But it was the time period that I got really fascinated by and that was the research that I did before I went in for the meeting. And then obviously, as we started working on it, we were all deep diving into that sort of stuff.
Okay. So one other thing that I want to ask before we really talk about any of the writing work that you did is you have this credit as an executive story editor. What did that entail? Is that a credit to sort of give you an idea where like what episodes you would end up writing? What does that mean?
It means a little bit different, something different on any show, just depending on what the showrunners want from you. Basically, a writer's room is just a group of people who are all there breaking the story. The writers get assigned episodes. Some do more, some do less. I am an executive story editor, and then I was a co-producer on the second season. It's sort of like a rung of ladder. You get to go up every year, or hopefully you get to go up every year. Um, it just means you're one of the writers in the room. And when you get a producer title, it means you have a little more responsibility. You tend more often to go to set and help, sort of guide from behind the director's chair. You're sort of, helping with the tone and keeping everything running. But mostly it just depends. I was, like any other writer's room, you're just fully baked into the storytelling of it all. And so you are helping break stories, helping create characters, helping develop all that different stuff. And I was just part of that. It's
Mhm.
not like a special uh, title. It's just one of the titles that you get as a writer on a television show.
Okay. I mean, it sounds awesome. Sounds fancy. I like it. It's so good.
Thank you.
So when you think about projects that you've worked on, what stands out to you about Halt and Catch Fire?
I remember the very first day that I went into that room, and we were all just sort of shooting the breeze, and suddenly it came out like this one had worked on Mad Men, and that one had worked on The Sopranos, and somebody worked on ER, and somebody worked on Deadwood, and I was like, oh my God. Like it was just a murderer's row of writers. And I knew, and they were like generous, human, lovely people. And I thought, okay, this could be one of the greatest experiences of my life. And the creators, they call them the Chris's, I'm sure you've heard that, Chris Rogers and Chris Cantwell, they were so, I mean, they were brand new as showrunners and as creators. This is the first thing that they had done. And they had brought in John Lithgow, who had run Southland for 5 years, who was just a genius. Like it was this incredible meld of people. And that it really does stand out. It really was my masterclass in storytelling, because I think what they really wanted and what they asked for was, how can we make it better? You've seen this idea on a television show. What can we do to push the story? What can we do to ask better questions? What can we do to really, expand the idea of these characters? And it was such a joy. Like it was incredible. So
Yeah.
that's
Well, thank you for sort of some of those broader answers. I know you worked on two great episodes that you have a writing credit for. So let's talk about those. So 107
yes.
Giant. This is a really interesting episode for Gordon. Okay, so let's start. We actually open with a nightmare from
Mhm.
Gordon. He is back in the hurricane that we saw in the previous episode. He's got a Cabbage Patch Kid in hand, and this time he sees the dead person in the street that he saw in real life. He sees it as himself.
Right.
Um, we know at this now that the show is over, we know that he's going to be diagnosed with CTE in season 2,
Hmm.
and he very well could be exhibiting symptoms of that already. So I'm curious, for you all in the writers' room, to what extent was this nightmare meant to be symbolizing an actual illness, or was it meant to be symbolic of something else? Where were you? What were you trying to get across in your discussions with that?
So, if I remember this correctly, and it has been a while, the CTE was specifically raised when we were starting season 2.
Yes.
But the thing that we loved about how far Gordon goes is, this is a genius level creator, engineer, who is also a pretty fragile person emotionally. And so this idea of how far he had been pushed, and how specifically in this episode, how pushed back from the actual control of anything he was in this episode, that he just didn't, everything that he had poured into it, all of his heart and soul, all of his creativity, all of those deadlines that he met, everything, all of a sudden was being usurped by this guy who walked in off the street. And so he was already in a place, and he just feels out of control in all these different parts of his life, and particularly where Joe is concerned. And so I think that the idea was, how far is he going to go? How far could we take it legitimately and make him, and push him to this edge, and then bring him back a little bit, obviously in later episodes. But I think it was a breaking point for him, and we wanted to see it in this great visual way.
Hmm. Yeah. Was there any idea, like, when you look at something like a character seeing themselves dead and you think about dream symbolism, is there meant to be some sort of like this aspect of him is dead? Or was it more the broader message that you were just sharing?
It's a great question. I mean, my instinct is, we were just showing how close to the edge he really was,
Yeah.
and how fragile and vulnerable he was. Because if he's dreaming that, and he's waking himself up out of a nightmare, and then his wife, who controls everything, goes out of town, and he's left, sort of shuttered away in the office, that he's just really falling down. He's really falling down a hole.
Yeah. and soon to be literally as well. Um, we get a couple new characters pretty much just for this episode,
Mhm.
and it's going to give us a lot more information about our core characters. So let's
Mhm.
start with Simon.
Sure.
So he is a designer, and he's going to come in to help work on the giant project, but also we find out that he's a past lover of Joe's and he's sick now. And this is not the only time in this series that somebody's going to come back into Joe's life and be like, I'm sick now. So this is going to be something that by season 4 we'll have seen this a couple times.
Right.
But this is the first time we're seeing that here. Um, Simon's take on it is that Joe wasn't ready to be as serious about their relationship as Simon was. And it gets Cam thinking about her situation. So I find this a really interesting pathway. Also interesting that we only got this character for one episode.
Right.
So what were you all interested to explore, and what were you interested to explore when working on the Simon scenes in this episode?
I think it's a great question because especially I think in season one, you're always wondering, is Joe a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he a builder? Is he a destroyer? Does he have the capacity for love? Is he always manipulating people? And so I feel like if you give him a past love story, then maybe he is caring. Maybe he is a guy who gets scared when he gets too close to things. As we start to sort of unfold his real life true story, his background, like all of this stuff that happened to him in his past, and you think this may have been a guy who was full of feeling and full of caring and just got shut down and hurt so much he doesn't have the capacity for it anymore. And if we were going to take Joe and Cameron's love story further, you had to figure out whether this was a guy, A, you wanted her to be with, right? Would you root for him? Would you root for them? And B, if he actually had it in him to be vulnerable. And so if you brought in somebody who he had been vulnerable to once before in his life, then you think, okay, it's possible. And when he runs back to her, spoiler, but when he runs back to her at the end and gets in the cab, he literally is running after her. And you think, um, sorry, I don't know what that was. And and you see him running after her, and you think, okay, maybe there is something here between the two of them.
It's such a good point because the way that I felt about Joe in the pilot episode, like there was a lot of work to get me on board with Joe, and by the end of the series, I'm on board with Joe.
Yeah.
But this is where it has to start here, right? Where you're giving us dimensions to him and more reason to see softer sides of him, and uh,
And to root for them. You know what I mean? I feel like, especially because once you get to season two, you're like, I don't want them together. Do I want them together? I don't want them together. Um, and even as he's blowing things up, you're like, this poor tortured man. Or I mean, that may just be me, but that feeling of like he has so much inside of him. He wants to do the right thing. He's bad at it, but he wants to do the right thing. Show him with a woman who is also complicated and, flinty and hard to get to know, like all of those things. They were a great match for each other, and those two actors were so great. But I do think that you needed that moment sort of halfway through the first season where you thought, maybe this is a thing. Maybe this could work. Maybe he is a feeling person and not just a robot who wants to manipulate everyone.
such a good point. So there's another character that comes in I mean, it really taps, this character is brought in and taps into a whole storyline that was discussed at length on this podcast. Kenny.
Yeah.
He's brought in as a potential supplier who can design the giant, competitor to Simon in this situation. Joe and Boz are going to meet with this guy at a club called Strokers. He's abrasive. He insults Boz's marriage with Ginny. But it's actually not until Kenny asks Joe if he's queer
Right.
that Boz actually hits Kenny.
Yep.
So I think it's a really interesting thing that Boz sort of lets it slide with the insult to him and his marriage,
Yep.
but like it's beyond the pale when it's about Joe, considering how abrasive their own relationship has been with each other.
Yep.
They Boz and Joe are not. It's been a strained situation, so this feels like a big gesture for Boz to make, and. What makes Boz hit Kenny in that moment?
So I, first of all, Toby Huss. Not enough good things can be said about Toby Huss, but I love Boz's journey, especially in season one. Here are these jackasses who came in and ruined his business and changed his life and manipulated him and screwed with him. And yet he's still open enough as a human to see what they're doing and to like see how they are potentially changing the world, right? And he gets sucked in. And by defending Joe, I think what you see is not necessarily that he's defending Joe, it's just he's come over to their side, right? And he believes in them, whether he wants to admit it or is ready to admit it or not. I think, at the end of this episode is when he sort of finds the 414 hackers idea. He's leaving his past behind by signing these divorce papers, and he's really walking forward into the future. So this is a man who, before Joe showed up and everything changed, he could have gone on exactly the same for the rest of his life and had a fine life. And then they came in and totally messed everything up. And he's playing 52 pickup, but he slowly inches over to their side till, a couple more episodes from now, he's defending them to Nathan and ready to put his own money into it. So I just think like here is a big turning point where he's ready to stand up for not just Joe and against this asshole, but for something. And I think that's what's great about that moment because you're like, it's so satisfying when he does, or it is to me, but it's so satisfying when he just walks out and you just see his face as he goes, like that was the right thing to do. And I
I
think it's
like your I like your point that Boz could have gone on forever exactly the way he had been and would have been fine because we certainly we know that Joe was like caused this huge hiccup, very dangerous
right.
situation in Boz's life and professional career. Um, but you almost forget that so quickly because we're very, we're then very aggressively thrust into the story of them building the giant and like whatever he had is gone. But yeah, he really could have had this other life.
He would have been fine. You know what I mean? He would have been close to his son. He would have, like all the things that are manifested after he gets involved with these people. He becomes a criminal. Like, this is there was nowhere that was on the horizon before they showed up. So I feel like that's a telling moment that he's sort of jumped to the other side.
Hmm. Now, of course, we're gonna get Donna and Hunt. Oh, we're gonna get Hunt. We go on a work trip with them. He
Yeah.
has been seducing her for some time now, and he's been trying to get information about the giant, and he's been getting that information successfully. Donna is gonna take it to the next step. On this work trip, she kisses him, and he stops her. He's an interesting character because a couple episodes from now, he's the villain, right? He's fully the villain. And
Yeah.
I don't,
Straight up.
when exactly did that turn happen? When did the bright idea come for him to be, doing this sabotage, this espionage, this corporate
Yeah.
espionage situation? But as you were working on this, as you all were breaking this story in the writer's room, did Hunt's seduction of Donna ever come from a place of interest in Donna, or was this exclusively from the beginning always about him pulling this over on Donna?
I think that you might be giving him too much credit as a schemer. Do you know what I mean? I really think that this is the episode where that comes to mind for him because she really does rattle off way too much about what Gordon has done. Now she's doing it because she's pissed. She's like, he's calling me and he wants to do he's great. I love him. He's done all of this amazing stuff. And by way of saying, I love my husband, I'm not trying to flirt with you. Here's how great he is. I'm going to tell you all these things he's done. I swear to God, I think that's the moment I was like, that's interesting.
So, okay, that this is interesting that you say this because previously, and in a previous episode, we saw him. They had this whole he calls her house, he gets her on the
Right.
phone. They have the peach pie scene.
Yeah.
And in that scene, the way it was shot, we get this really interesting shot from like over the shoulder to look at his ring.
Uh-huh.
his wedding ring while he's on the phone with her. But they're having this flirty
Yeah.
conversation. So for you, this was the turn. And that was, he was still kind of walking a good
Yeah,
path.
I think so. Here's what I think, and I could be totally wrong. You're going to interview another writer, they'll be like, Jamie's crazy. But I think that Hunt represents everything Donna's parents thought she should marry, right? He is the country club boy. He has a good, steady job. He is a, upstanding Texas citizen. Gordon is the outlier. He's the one that they look at and they're like, he's never going to make it, and he's already screwed her over. Like it's just with the whole thing with the symphonic, he just feels like to them, to the parents, a charity case, and she sees the magic in Gordon, right? But Hunt is who she should have married, or she should have married. And so when he flirts with her, she needs that. Gordon has been gone. Gordon has been, kind of tough lately. And here's this guy who's paying her attention and flirting with her and is good at his job. And she knows that guy. Like she knows that guy. She grew up with that guy. And I think that that's enticing. And so when he continues to flirt with her, you know, it's hard to turn that down, especially when you're not getting the attention from home. You're the heavy at home with, always taking care of the kids. You're always at the job. You're always doing the thing. And here's somebody who's like, you're pretty. It's like she responds. And I think it's her downfall. And I love the moment at Comdex when she goes right after him. Like she literally is going to throttle him on the floor, but it's because she made the mistake.
Hmm. Yeah, she let him in.
Yeah,
She gave up way too much information.
she did.
Um, Gordon obviously came up a lot of times in that answer as it needs to, and if we have, it would be remiss not to mention a very important detail. Like one of the most upsetting details in this show, really. Gordon digging a grave-sized hole in his backyard. It's alarming. It's such an alarming visual. Tell us about working on this scene.
Okay, so when we were doing when we were breaking this story, this is my memory, is we were all trying to come up with a name for the computer. So we were always floating things. And I love the Cardiff Giant story, like the actual thing. And I brought it into the room and I was like, is there a version of this that we can use? It doesn't, it shouldn't be the name of the computer because it's a fake and it was a fraud. And then there's PT Barnum, like all that stuff is true. And they're like, wait, like, how can we do this? And so the idea of the digging came from that, the idea of um, Joe being P.T. Barnum and the, sort of metaphor of the story, all of that came from the idea of what if we name it the Giant? And when Gordon first launches that idea, he's like, because the whole thing with the contrail, which I think is hilarious, um, he's like, why don't you just call it the Giant? Like, idiot, right? Is what he's thinking. And of course, that's what they wind up calling it. Um, and I think you see the devolution of Gordon in that episode of he is, taught his ideas are tossed aside. He's going to have to start over to make the computer fit the suit. Um, he goes home and his daughters are, all of the things, all the pieces. He cuts his hand. There's a leak in the thing. Everything is going wrong for him. I think he just goes to the dark side. And the girls start the digging. I mean, it is fair that he didn't just go out there and dig a hole. He went out there, took them, put them back in the house, and then who knows exactly what. But yeah,
Sure. It's not a natural reaction to what happens when you see
no,
your
it's
kids
not.
digging a hole in
It's
the
not. It's
backyard.
not. It's not a human reaction. But I think one of the things that I loved so much about working on the show was we used to call it in the room taking an astronaut walk. I'm just remembering this. That you would just be like, I'm going to get out of the capsule and I'm going to take a walk, right? And it was this idea that anything was a game. You could make any completely out there suggestion. Like I remember it started in, I want to say scene in episode 103 when Joe goes down to the wine cellar and kisses the boyfriend of Gene Smart.
Lulu, yeah.
And we're like, can we? Is that a thing we can do? And we're like, "Yeah, well, yeah." And so this idea of challenging what the normal human reaction would be that still felt logical somehow, that's what we were trying to do. And I think that that was an extreme version of it, but I think it still made sense. And it was theatrical and bold, and I think we all really loved it.
It ends up being the most magnificent foreshadowing,
Right. Right. And I
like
think,
all across the whole series.
absolutely. I think that this is what happens in a good writer's room is you're leaving yourself breadcrumbs. You don't necessarily know it, but then you can look back and you'd be like, what if he really was having mental issues? And those were the little breadcrumbs that we left ourselves to get here. And
It's
if you
interesting
don't
that the story came before the name of the device.
say it again,
And
sorry.
it's interesting that the story of the P.T. Barnum story came before the name of the giant in the writer's room.
Yeah. Well, it was because it's the story of the Cardiff Giant, right? It was in, I want to say it was in Cardiff, New York. And this farmer decided to bury a giant and then unearth it, or have his workers unearth it by accident a year later, and then he would sort of sell it. And so it was this sideshow. And so that was the idea, that Gordon was insulting it by saying, why don't you just call it the giant? If you're going to be all about the way it looks and not what it does, just call it the giant. And so
Yeah.
that's sort of where it started.
So brilliant. So if we look at 206,
Mhm.
you skip ahead a season, and my goodness, you have a whole different set of players involved
Yeah.
here. So this one is 10 Broad 36.
Yes.
Jacob is involved now,
Mhm.
and he wants to maximize profits
Yes.
with the profits they'll get from Mutiny, and he wants to go against Joe's initial pitch to Mutiny.
Mhm.
And we begin to see how ruthless a businessman Jacob actually is. For you, why was it important for us to see Jacob in season two?
I think up until Jacob shows up, we don't have, I mean, Boz sort of is when we first meet him, but he changes, a very traditional, straight up businessman. Um, that he's not a creative, right? If it makes him money, great. If it doesn't, then who cares? And he's a bottom line guy. And to make him Joe's father-in-law, and to have Joe do his Joe thing, or try to do his Joe thing around James Cromwell, you know what I mean? um, it was just really exciting to have somebody who could go toe to toe with him and see Joe, like see through Joe and be like, I see what you're doing. And not let him get away with stuff and have to deal with a very straight up old school business model.
When you name drop James Cromwell, I'm curious, when you're all in the writer's room and you're breaking story, and then you get down to the point of like writing specific episodes, and things haven't necessarily been cast yet because you're
Mhm.
creating it now. Um, do you ever have ideas about who you want to play certain roles?
Yeah, sometimes you do. It's less about like, let's get James Cromwell. And it's more about you'll throw names of actors around so that you're all on the same page about what you're writing. And the casting directors on this show were phenomenal. They're so, so good. They've done so many great things. Um, and they would come up with great names. But sometimes you're like, I hear this person's voice. And we write to that. We may or may not get that actor, but it helps sort of craft it in a really healthy way so that everybody is really on the same page when they're writing the character.
Yeah, it creates alignment. Interestingly enough, I interviewed Alexa Palladino,
Oh, it's great.
and she's the only one who came in. She still had the emails from when she was auditioning for the role,
Fabulous.
and she read her casting breakdown of what they were looking for with her role with Sarah, and it was like an essay on who Sarah Wheeler was.
Oh, interesting.
um it was wild because when she read it back, I was like, wow, that's what they gave you at the beginning, because that's her whole story.
That's fascinating. I know that one of the great things about being in that writer's room was we did serious deep dives on the characters. When we first started on season one, we sort of created biographies for everybody. Everybody got, handed a character and they were like, now go off and tell us about this character. And we had little book reports. Um, but we spent a good like the first 2 weeks just talking about who these people were and what they wanted and where they came from and what, stories we could be telling about them and how their, like what their marriage was like, Don and, Gordon's marriage was like, and what their home life had been like and where they had been, like all of these things, which is a luxury, right? I've been on a lot of shows where you're on the first season and, and you don't take that kind of time, but they were really character forward in that way. And so I think that pays off. And I'm sure that as we went forward, we did that with Sarah. Who is the woman that he would have gone up in the mountains to find? And who was she in his past? And what was that going to be? And who could she be connected to? That's the complication. And that's where the dad came from.
So this was not specifically an episode that you wrote, but you were in the writer's room when at the end of season 1, when we get that cliffhanger that Joe's going to go for a hike, he's going to go up and he's going to find her or she, or a pronoun is used. Was there any thought at that time of who that person was? Or is that something that you all said, we're going to say she, and then we're going to come back when we get a season 2 and we're going to figure out who she is?
It is a little bit of the latter. We knew that we wanted him to go off on a like spiritual journey of some sort. And we liked the idea that he was going up to the telescope. And then after that, we weren't 100%. I may not be remembering this correctly, but my memory is there was a woman, there was a telescope, there were mountains. And then we were like, I guess we'll figure it out if we get a pickup.
This is like one of the more hotly contested details. I love this. We're getting the truth. It's so good.
I feel like I'm telling tales out of school. They're like, maybe I shouldn't be telling, but
well,
that
some
was true.
people have gone in another direction and said maybe it was meant to be Joe's mom, and maybe she wasn't initially supposed to die, and that got like retconned into a scene with Joe and his dad earlier that season in season 1. But by that point, we know we've heard that his mom is dead.
Yeah.
So like people have to sort of turn a blind eye to that if they want to go with that theory.
I
But
think so. I do remember to your people's credit, we did have is she alive discussions for sure. Are we going to find her? Should he go see her? Was he hiding her? Was, the dad hiding her? Like all that, those all came up. We just landed where we landed.
Jamie, you might very well have made every single person who's listening to this feel gratified, regardless of how they feel. I like it. You've
It
given
definitely came up.
everybody a thing to be proud of. This is so good. We have another new character this season, Tom.
Yep.
But what I love about this episode is that we get our first Tom and Joe scene.
Oh yeah.
Which is so good. And every time in this series we're going to get a Tom and Joe face off, it's going to be worth it. But this is our first chance to see what that looks like. And we've got Tom, he's got, he's the new boyfriend. He's with Cam, and Joe's the ex.
Right.
Tom knows that. Joe may or may not know that.
Yeah.
When I look at the dialogue in this scene, it's technical and it doesn't necessarily read like a battle over Cam, but
Yeah.
the way it plays does. And there's a certain power dynamic that's happening there. So given that you wrote this, like, I don't know how much screen direction you actually had in there. What were you envisioning in the writing process?
Oh, they are 100% sizing each other up. And, Tom is so smart and so technical. His technical language is to test Joe. Like, how smart is this guy? How much does he know about what this business is? How much of a good match is he or was he for Cameron? I think that the technical speak is deliberate, right? To see, does this guy know what he's talking about or not? And that actually plays into the ruse that they play on him later, because Tom is the one who says he knows enough, but he doesn't know that much. And then there's Joe, who's also like, so this is the next iteration, like this, because he seems like such a easygoing young man. You know, he's got a spine, but he's not complicated in the same way that Joe is. And he
Do you think
doesn't,
Joe definitely knows in this scene that Tom is a love interest to Cam? Because it's not 100% certain at
yeah,
this point.
I think he suspects. Um, that's my instinct is, and I'm trying to remember if what we landed on, but I think he's, smart enough to know something else. If this guy is paying this much attention to him, there must be something else going on underneath.
Nobody else is coming over and having that
Correct.
kind of conversation with
Right. Well, and
Joe.
there's like what I really love is when, I mean, God, when Joe walks in the door and so this is mutiny is so much like that whole beat was so much fun. But there are guys there that know him, like Lev and, all these people that were already at Cardiff and moved over to Mutiny. Their attitude towards him is so interesting when he walks in the door too.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we go back to Jacob for a moment, so we know that Jacob had actually given Joe some latitude to be lenient with mutiny in the negotiation, and instead Joe plays hardball. And he's pushing Mutiny to meet benchmarks that Jacob actually never even asked for, in order to get the lowest hourly rate that Jacob said he was okay with to begin with. So I had been thinking from early on in this season, like pretty much from the moment that Joe is playing tank battle late at night with Cam
Yeah.
just after having gotten engaged to Sarah.
Mhm.
I'm sitting there thinking he wants to find a way back to Cam somehow, and this is all like on some level. But this was an interesting like way to mix that up for me. So like what makes Joe want to push Mutiny like this at this point in the story?
So when I think about Joe, I mean, it's almost his tragedy that he's a visionary, right? He understands like, he can identify when something is going to change the world. And he can see it, and he can see 20 steps ahead of him, but he can't make it. Like, he just can't make it himself. And so he needs a Gordon, and he needs a Cameron. And so, in order to be the person that he wants to be, he has to be connected to Mutiny, right? Because he believes they're the future and he wants to be part of the future. And so I think that this is literally his downfall is he's like, he has to get back in, right? And he sees like the way that Donna sees community as the way forward, as this interconnectedness that we're going to all be doing in the future. He sees the broadband thing. He sees the community part of it. He understands that in one day they can figure this out, right? All of that stuff, he can't actually do it himself. And so in order to reconnect and get back in the game, he's got to give them these benchmarks because he has to be included. And so I
Mhm.
think that that's what it is. It isn't that he's playing with them. I don't even think it's about Cameron as a love interest in that moment. I think it's he so needs to be Steve Jobs that he's going to do whatever it takes to get back in with the people he thinks can get him there.
Okay. Fair enough. Now, of course, all of this is going to lead to this Ocean's 11 type heist that we get towards the end, which must have been challenging to write given that it's so technical, everything that's
Yeah,
happening here. But tell us about working on this scene.
I love this scene. None of it could have been done without our technical advisor. I think it was Carl who was literally feeding me lines of, just the technical language. It's the same way, I've worked on cop shows and military shows and medical shows. Like, I'm not those things, but you bring in these technical advisors and they're amazing and they can give you, the language that makes them sound like they know exactly what they're doing. So that's first of all, which is the technical advisors, like we bow down. Um, and there was somebody on set who was working with the equipment to make sure that it was all being handled properly and the chips go in the right places and the wires go in the right places and the Ethernet cable goes in the right place. And then the director and the production designer, art director come in and we want to shoot from underneath, or we want to find the cables, or we want to see the thing, sort of spritz out, or all of those things. It is this it's what I love about TV, about working in series, is it is the most collaborative medium you can work in on this level, because that scene doesn't come together without the actors, the designers, the director, the writers, the technical advisors, the production people. Like, it's just, that one's magic to me, how that came together. And then, and then in post with the editing of it, you get like your heart races because you're like, is it going to work? Is it going to work? And that's editing and that's direction. And so like the music, you know what I mean? All of these pieces come together. So like I can imagine stuff on the page, but if all of the other stuff doesn't happen, it doesn't come together that way and it doesn't make your heart race.
Yeah. It's so beautifully executed. A much more subtle scene is one that we get between Donna and her mom.
Yeah.
And so Donna lies to her mom about having had a miscarriage.
Right.
Um, and the reaction we get from her mom makes me feel like maybe her mom has some personal experience with this.
Yeah.
We're later going to see Cam bring Donna to Planned Parenthood to get an abortion.
Yep.
Uh, we don't really ever get much overt language from Donna about this decision. I can imagine this is an incredibly dicey topic to bring to a screen. Tell us about writing women's health scenes like this.
You know, I think 10 years ago is different to write it than now, for sure. And it wasn't so much that we didn't want her to talk about it, it was period accuracy. This is the early 80s. And so, and we actually, if my memory serves, we wrote the physical, she goes into the thing, she has the little thing, she goes through the procedure. But what we ultimately realized was, we didn't have to torture the character or the audience with it physically. We had already tortured her emotionally, right? That this decision was wrenching to her and the struggle was the story. And so it wasn't so much about, to me, it wasn't so much about the actual abortion itself as it was, she was in a male-dominated business. She was making a decision completely alone. She didn't feel like she could tell her husband or he would convince her to keep it, I think. Boz was the only person she could tell. And there was an early draft where I think Boz took her to Planned Parenthood and she didn't tell Cameron. But ultimately, what I love about this story is these are the two women in our show and their friendship and their working partnership and their learning how to navigate each other and come together and like build this thing together. That's the story of season 2 in so many ways. And so the idea that when it looks like Mutiny's going to crater and they've lost everything, Donna says, I need you to come somewhere with me, and opens herself up. And I love the car scene because, what Cameron says is, you don't have to do this for the business because the business is about to go under. And Donna says, I'm not doing it for the business. Because I think you needed to say that out loud too. And then do you want me to come in with you? And she says, no. And then you see Cameron be like, oh, of course I'm going in. Like, of course I'm going in. And then you understand something more about the two of them as a friendship, as a partnership, as the growing, sort of connection between the two of them. And I think that's the story that we wanted to tell. There are certainly ways to use it as a hot button issue. And God knows at the moment that we're in current history, it's horrifying. And I think we would probably tell this story a little differently. But given that it's the 80s and it's this particular circumstance, I think that was the right way to go.
For anybody who's really interested in diving deeper into this specific topic, the ATX TV Festival this year, so the 2024 ATX TV Festival
Mhm.
did a whole panel about women's reproductive rights on screen, and Carrie Bechet was on the panel.
Oh, how
And so
fabulous.
she got a chance to talk a little bit about this storyline. And there was a whole bunch of people who work on different shows and different
Mhm.
capacities. So it was interesting in that it really sort of charts um, different, how current politics of a time might impact the story that goes on screen or the the politics of the time period that you're showing has to obviously be reflected as well. So there's a it was a really interesting conversation actually. Um,
Yeah, I
but
would talk to other writers and showrunners about, how you portray women's reproductive rights on television. And, look, when we were writing this, it was the Obama years. You know what I mean? It was a completely different landscape than even just 2016, 2 years later,
yeah.
and and since. And so the it it was an accepted procedure, but it just wasn't spoken about. And certainly in a male-dominated business and in a male-dominated house that they were living in, that isn't anything she's going to be talking about to anybody or calling out, because I think it would have made especially 20-year-old men uncomfortable and confused. And what do you say to a 30-year-old woman who has two kids? Like, they barely know how to talk to her anyway. So I think that all of that played into it.
It also plays really well into the story of season two because they both, in this marriage, the two of them have a big secret from each other. Eventually, Gordon has to tell Donna about his because it's going to become apparent very soon that he's been diagnosed with CTE. But it is interesting because for some episodes, they're both carrying something that they can't tell each other about, and watching that tension is kind of fascinating to see how little they can communicate with each other.
Yeah, well, and also that the last that airplane scene in 210, where he's like, "We should have another," and you just see her kind of collapse, and I love that because she's never going to tell him. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So, and
yeah.
then I just, that was great.
Well, there's a detail that you are able to spot from one of my previous recaps that I'm so glad we get to explain. I missed a reference in this episode. It was in a conversation between Henry and Gordon
Yes,
to Land Shark. What's that?
there's an SNL sketch, a Saturday Night Live sketch, and it was one of those they repeated a bunch, and we all loved it. And it basically was, I can't remember who played the shark. So. There would be a woman inside an apartment and someone would knock on the door and she'd go, "Who is it?" And you'd hear, "Pizza delivery." And she'd go, "I didn't order a pizza." And they go, "Taxi cab." And she goes, "I didn't order a taxi cab." And she opens the door and it's a man dressed in a shark and he goes, "Land shark." And he eats her. And it was absurd and ridiculous. And it was really funny. And so land shark became this thing that everybody just said back then. So there you go.
Okay, well there you have it.
You should look it up.
Uh,
It's ridiculous and probably even now probably quaint and kind of stupid. But it was like you would just go pizza delivery, and that was
okay. Well, I love it. It's so good to have this context, and I am gonna check that out and see if there are any videos of this on YouTube. Oh my gosh. Well, okay. So, were there any characters that you particularly enjoyed writing?
so when I was talking about when we all sort of were assigned characters in the beginning, they gave me Donna, and I had such an affinity for Donna because I had littler kids, I had two kids. My husband travels for work, so I was almost entirely in charge of them, and I was a working mom. And I I understood her. I felt like I I felt her, right? And so a lot of the conversations that we had, I really, and I was the only, besides our writer's assistant, who was a wonderful woman named Karen McGoldrick, I was the only mom in the room. And that happens, unfortunately, a lot in writers' rooms, but I was the only mom. And so there's certain things about being a working mom, about being the primary parent who's the caregiver. And I love the idea that in season two, she took, you know, he was more of the primary parent. But I really loved her and I understood her. And the one thing that I wanted to share was, okay, so in the end of 206, when she sings Haley to sleep, um, baby mine, that was, first of all, Haley is whole. I had an 8-year-old daughter at the time who slept with an elephant whose name is Sadie. And I used to sing, "Sadie mine, don't you cry." And so we pulled it over to be Haley mine. And that was the song I sang to my daughter since she was born. And she had a stuffed elephant. And so these are the ways that, like, as a writer, sometimes your own life kind of infects what you're doing, but this was a straight up steal.
Whoa, and that's a big steal.
Yeah.
because nobody, by the time you get to season four, nobody forgets that song. You
Yeah.
know, like that's
And
it's memorialized in a way that like probably goes beyond what you thought was happening when you put
it
that in this
does.
episode.
And you know what's great about it is so when you're writing something, you write in what you hope they could use. So I wrote in Baby Mine. Now, a Disney song is expensive. Like it's really expensive to get the rights to use a Disney song. And so, and you know, budget is huge on every show that you're ever on. And so they came to me and they're like, I don't know if we can use it. And so start thinking of songs that are in the public domain, lullabies that are in the public domain.
Like
So
Happy Birthday. Try Happy
exactly,
Birthday.
exactly. And so there are lullabies that are in the public domain that are fine. And I found a couple of them and I kind of made them work. And I still remember the day they walked into my office and they're like, we got it. It was just too good. We couldn't resist it. We're going to lay off some things from, from the next episode into the whatever it was, whatever they moved around. I was always incredibly grateful because it was so meaningful to me that my little baby's song was Haley's.
Ah, so good. What a good thing to know about that detail because it's such an important detail to the show. It's going to be used over and over again in season four. Um,
Yeah.
so good.
And in fact, when you're producing the episode, they'll sometimes call the writer and be like, because it said maybe she's holding a stuffed animal, and they're like, "What kind of stuffed animal?" And I was like, "Elephant." And so then they would send me here are a couple of elephants that we bought, and I was like, "No, no, no, not that one, not one." And so I just sent them a picture of my daughter holding her elephant. And then that went to props, and props found an elephant that looked a lot like the one that Sadie held till, she was, around the same age. So,
And that also works well because we're going to end up seeing, elephant stuffed animal like later in the series as well. But even previous to this, we had seen the conversation that Gordon was having with his kids about, well, could we afford to buy, are we so rich we could buy
how to
an
go get an
elephant?
elephant. That's right.
Um,
I forgot about that.
yeah, so like I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, but it works perfectly that elephants were on the mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's
Yeah.
like, no, we gotta get two elephants because they'll get lonely.
But even with that, probably don't have space even for
Not in
one.
the backyard. Okay. Where we put it. Yeah.
Yeah, so good. So, as we sort of run down on time here, are there any other favorite moments from working on the show or scenes that you wanted to make sure we mentioned here?
Um, I I mean, the moment when in 206, when Joe walks into Mutiny, and it's the first time we see him there, we really wanted it to have like an impact, right? And have a movie star entrance. And the way that they built that was so delightful. Like it was just, you write stuff and you're like, I wonder how this will look. And then they pull it off and you're like, God, it looks great. It looks better than I thought. That happens a lot. When you're lucky and you work on a show with creatives that are this good and they bring in these amazing directors and this incredible team. I thought the wardrobe, the costumes were incredible, but the Mutiny set. I remember the first day that I walked on it was when I went for my episode, and the detail on that set was just unbelievable. Like just hats off to the set decorators and production designers and all of the period specific stuff on the walls, but also the way that all the wires and everything that was there was so carefully thought out and chaotic and wonderful to look at. I just, you're really lucky when you get to work on a show like this. That's all.
Oh, this is so beautifully said. And just your point about Joe's entrance. I believe it was this episode that I did an interview with Mary Griffin, who was a stand-in for Mackenzie Davis this season, and she was recounting, I believe, the scene where he comes into Mutiny for the first time, and he sort of like takes off his glasses and he's looking all suave, and she's like, "Yeah, the first take when he did that, just all of the women on set were like." And
Yeah,
I couldn't use it because it was very audible.
really funny. I mean, we were all sort of like, okay, that's gonna work.
Like, mhm.
Great. Lee was
Yeah.
great. I mean, all the actors that we got, but those four actors were just spectacular, thoughtful and interesting and smart, and inquisitive. Like it's really good. It's a great
Mm.
experience.
Well, I never know how to close with this question because it's been such a strange time in your industry, but I want to give you a space to plug something else. So it could be
Oh,
something that you're working on. It could be something you've done recently. I know that you may or may not be able to talk about current things if they're happening. So what do
no,
you
I'm
want to tell
happy
us
to.
about?
I'm very grateful to be a working writer. I am working on two Ryan Murphy shows right now. I am doing Dr. Odyssey on ABC, which is currently airing. And then I'm working on a show called All's Fair for him, which is going to air next year. There's no air date yet, but it'll be, I think, spring or summer of 2025, with a very starry and fun cast. And so those are the two things that I'm working on right now.
Oh, this is so great to hear. I'm really excited that now that people are talking about more current projects because it's like,
Yeah.
oh, we all want to see these things come to screen. So it all starts with you being able to say that things are happening behind the scenes. So this is great.
Yep. Yeah, it's all good. And I think, I mean, Dr. Odyssey is, I think they're airing like their fifth episode this week. There'll be 18 of those, so a good healthy run. And then All's Fair will be 10 episodes on Hulu next season.
18, that's like
It's rare.
you don't even hear about like I
I
mean I know
know.
back in the day it was like 23, 24 episodes in a season, but
Yeah.
18, I haven't it's been a while since I've seen a show that had that many episodes in a season.
We had I worked on Chicago PD for 2 years, and that was 22, and that's a lot of episodes of TV.
That's a
And
lot
they've
to
sort of
write.
settled down to, if they're going to do a full season. That's not true. I did, and I last season and the last two seasons I did So Help Me Todd on CBS, and they were 21, and then we got 10 because of the strike, but it was going to be 22. So they were healthy runs, and this one's a good healthy run, and there just aren't that many network shows that do this anymore. So I feel very grateful, and especially right now when it's really tough in the industry. So I'm super grateful to be working.
Well, I can't wait to see what comes out next for you, and thank you so much for taking
It's
time
my
and talking with
pleasure.
us.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a
Yeah,
pleasure.
and I have to say, you did some heavy lifting. You answered some really hot button questions
Oh
along
God,
the
I'm so
way.
excited.
So,
I hope
yeah.
I hope I did you right. I hope I did you right.
I think you probably made people feel pretty gratified along the way. Somehow you managed to make everybody feel that way, I think. So awesome. Great work.
Thank you so much.
And to those who are watching this right now, thank you for watching. And please go out there and watch Halt and Catch Fire. Bye, everybody.